In this lesson, we're going to look at how to solve a quadratic equation by using factoring. Your essential question is explain the steps to solve a quadratic equation using factoring. So if you'd please take a minute to set up your notebook, and as soon as you're ready, get your, just start it back up again. Can't think of what I was going to say. Okay, so solving quadratics by factoring. When can we use factoring to solve a quadratic? Okay, the basic answer to that is if it can be factored, we can use factoring. If it can be factored, then we can use it. We're going to look at several different methods, and so in the end, you're going to be able to ask yourself, what method do you want to use? And so again, if it can be factored, then you can use factoring to solve it. So one of the key ideas behind using factoring is this property called the zero product property. And this property says that if A times B equals 0, then we know that either A has to equal 0 or B has to equal 0, right? That makes sense. We know something times 0 always equals 0. So one of those has to be 0, okay? That's the idea behind the zero product property. And so here's an example of a quadratic equation that is already factored. Y plus 2 is a factor, y minus 6 is a factor. And so the way this property works is we're saying that either this factor, y plus 2, has to equal 0, or this factor, y minus 6, equals 0. So do you see how I took each factor and I put them equal to 0? And so now we're going to solve each equation, and we get y equals negative 2 and y equals 6. And so we have two solutions. Remember, those are called our solutions, our roots, our zeros, or our x-intercepts. They all mean the same thing. We talked about when we graphed that we can have two x-intercepts or roots or zeros. We can have one or we can have none. Okay, and so it's the same applies when we're solving. So our solutions here would be negative 2 and 6. Okay, so our steps to factoring, these are really important, especially this step number 1. We have to make sure that our equation is equal to 0. Okay, otherwise the zero product property doesn't come into play. Then we're going to factor it. Then we're going to put each factor equal to 0. And then we're going to solve each of those equations. Okay, so let's look at our examples. Number 1, we have a binomial here. So I would start by pulling out my greatest common factor, which is 2q. That's going to leave me with 9 minus q. Okay. And so now I'm going to take each factor and put each factor equal to 0. Okay. And I'm going to solve each of those equations. Here, if we divide by 2, we get q equals 0. Right here, minus 9. Divide by a negative, and we get q equals positive 9. So my two solutions are 0 and 9. Okay, let's look at the second example. Notice that this equation is not equal to 0. So the first thing I need to do is subtract 9n from both sides so that my equation is equal to 0. Okay. I still have a binomial, so I see that I have a greatest common factor of 3n. When I divide that out, that leaves me with 9 minus 3. Okay. Now that I have it factored, I'm going to take each factor and put each factor equal to 0. And so here we would get n equals 0. Here we would get n equals 3. So again, I have two solutions, 0 and 3. Okay, let's look at the next example. Whoops, number 3. We have another quadratic equation. It's not equal to 0. So I'm going to start out by subtracting 7 from both sides so that I can get this equal to 0. Okay, so now we're going to take the time to factor this trinomial. My a value is 1. And so my factors are going to be -5 and +3. Since the a value is 1, I can simply say my factors are y minus 5 and y plus 3. Now we put each factor equal to 0 and solve each of those equations. So we're going to get y equals 5 and -3. Okay, look at number 4. Again, we want to get our equation equal to 0. So I'm going to move the 15 over by adding it. Okay, now I'm going to stop for a second with that one. I want you to factor this trinomial. It's a little bit harder, but I want you to use your factoring rules and factor it and see if you can finish it from there. And then on number 5, okay, we need to get this one equal to 0. I'm going to suggest maybe that we should go ahead and move our terms over here, and that way we can keep our x squared positive. So this would be x squared plus 4/3 x minus 4/9 equals 0. Okay, and I want you to see if you can think about that one. See if you can factor that, and then we'll go from there. And then I want you to also think about what does one solution tell us about the graph of the equation. And so we'll talk about those last 3 things, number 4, 5, and the question in class tomorrow.